Richard Castellano stood in the doorway of the medical suite he'd built inside his mansion, watching his 8-year-old twins Ma and Jacob lying, motionless, on adjacent hospital beds. Their small bodies connected to monitors that beeped softly in the silence, and for the 347th morning in a row, he felt his heart shatter into pieces too small to count. The doctors had said there was no name for what plagued his children, no diagnosis that fit the constellation of symptoms: chronic fatigue, weakness, loss of appetite, pale skin, listless eyes, and so Richard had done what any father with unlimited resources would do. He'd hired specialists from Switzerland, immunologists from Johns Hopkins, holistic healers from Tibet, spent $4 million on experimental treatments, converted the entire east wing of his Connecticut estate into a sterile medical facility, and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Not since the car accident 2 years ago that had taken his wife, Catherine, and left him alone with 2 children who seemed to be fading a little more each day. What Richard didn't notice, what he couldn't see through the fog of his own desperation and grief, was that every time he left the room, something shifted, subtle change, that only one person had begun to recognize. And that person was Grace O'Connor, the 53-year-old woman who'd been hired 6 months ago to help maintain the sprawling estate. A woman whose official title was housekeeper, but whose quiet observations were about to unravel everything. Grace had emigrated from Nigeria 15 years earlier, worked 3 jobs to put her own daughter through nursing school, and possessed the kind of wisdom that came not from books, but from truly seeing people, from paying attention to the things others missed. And what she'd been noticing about the Castellano twins troubled her deeply, because it didn't add up. She'd been cleaning the medical wing early one morning when she heard genuine, childlike laughter, and when she'd peeked through the door, she'd seen Emma and Jacob sitting up in their beds, playing cards, color in their cheeks, light in their eyes, completely unlike the listless children she'd seen just hours before when their father had been present for the morning examination. Grace had said nothing, just filed the observation away. But then it happened again, and again she'd catch glimpses of the children animated, whispering to each other, drawing pictures, looking for all the world like normal, healthy until they'd hear their father's footsteps in the hallway, and suddenly they'd deflate, sinking back into their pillows, their faces going blank and pale, their voices dropping to weak whispers. The transformation was so complete, so instantaneous, that Grace began to wonder if what she was witnessing was something the children were doing unconsciously, some kind of learned behavior that neither they nor their father understood. And the more she watched, the more convinced she became that the sickness everyone was trying to cure wasn't in their bodies at all. Grace had learned bits and pieces of the family's story from Marcus, the estate manager who'd worked for the Castellanos for 12 years, how Catherine Castellano had been the warmth of the household, how she'd baked cookies with the twins every Sunday, took them hiking, read to them every night, how Richard had been the busy executive, always traveling, always in meetings, providing everything money could buy but rarely present, and how after Catherine's death, Richard had collapsed inward, his grief transforming into a frantic, obsessive focus on the children's health, convinced that every sniffle was a sign of something catastrophic, every moment of tiredness evidence of a mysterious illness. Marcus said the twins had been normal, boisterous children, right up until about 6 months after their mother's funeral, when they'd begun displaying the symptoms that now consumed Richard's every waking moment. But what if, Grace thought as she dusted the family photos in the main hallway, what if the symptoms started not because of illness, but because 2 grieving children had learned that being sick was the only way to keep their father close, the only way to hold his attention, the only language of love he seemed capable of speaking anymore. The theory felt both profound and heartbreaking, and Grace knew she had to be certain before saying anything, because accusing a grieving man of misunderstanding his own children's suffering was not something to be done lightly. So she began to pay closer attention, to volunteer for tasks that kept her near the medical wing, to observe not as a housekeeper, but as someone who'd raised a child alone, who understood the complicated ways that trauma and love could tangle together. She watched as Dr. Hendricks, the primary physician, ran another round of blood tests while Emma flinched and whimpered, watched as Richard held his daughter's hand with such desperate tenderness that Grace had to look away, watched as the doctor stepped into the hallway afterward and told Richard the same thing he'd been saying for months. The tests show nothing conclusive, but we'll keep searching. And she watched Richard's face crumble with frustration and fear. That afternoon, while Richard was on a video call with a specialist in Munich, Grace brought the children their lunch bland, carefully calibrated meals designed for sensitive systems, and Emma looked at the pale soup and dry toast with such longing and disappointment that Grace's heart ached, and without thinking, she whispered, "If you could have anything for lunch, sweet girl, what would it be?" Emma's eyes went wide, darting toward the door, as if checking for surveillance, before she whispered back, "Pizza like Mama used to make, with the cheese that gets all crispy on the edges." And Jacob added, his voice barely audible, "And we'd eat it on the floor of the living room like a picnic. And Mama would let us watch cartoons, and she'd do funny voices for all the characters." And suddenly both children had tears streaming down their faces, and Grace understood with absolute clarity that she was looking not at sick children, but at two souls so hollowed out by grief and so desperately afraid of losing their remaining parent that they'd unconsciously trapped themselves in a prison of symptoms. And their father, equally trapped in his own grief, had built bars around them made of medicine and monitors and specialists, never realizing that what his children needed couldn't be ordered from Switzerland or Johns Hopkins. That night, Grace went home to her small apartment in Hartford and called her daughter, Chinen, who was finishing her residency at Yale New Haven Hospital, and described everything she'd observed. And Chinua was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Mama, what you're describing sounds like it could be psychosomatic illness. The mind-body connection is real. Especially in children who've experienced trauma, grief can manifest as physical symptoms, and if the children are getting positive reinforcement for being sick, even unconsciously, it can create a cycle that's incredibly hard to break without addressing the underlying emotional cause." And Grace asked what should be done, and Chinen said, "Someone needs to talk to the father, needs to help him see that his children need him to be a parent, not a medical manager. They need normal life, play, processing their grief. But it's delicate, because he's suffering too. And you can't just tell a parent they've been handling everything wrong, especially when they've been trying so hard, spending so much, doing everything they think is right." Grace barely slept that night, wrestling with whether she had any right to involve herself in something so personal, so far beyond her role as an employee. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emma and Jacob's faces, saw the way they came alive when they felt safe to be children, and wilted when they felt they had to be patients. And she thought about her own daughter, about the years she'd worked herself to exhaustion to give Chinne opportunities, and how she would have wanted someone to speak up if she'd been too lost in her own pain to see what her child really needed. The next morning, Grace arrived at the estate 2 hours early and asked Marcus if there was any way she could speak with Mr. Castellano privately, and Marcus raised his eyebrows. In 6 months, Grace had barely exchanged more than pleasantries with the master of the house, but something in her face must have convinced him, because he nodded and said he'd arrange it. Richard met her in his study at 7 a.m., looking exhausted, his expensive suit rumpled, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, and he was polite but clearly confused about why his housekeeper had requested a meeting. And for a moment Grace's courage faltered, because who is she to challenge this man's understanding of his own children? But then she thought of Emma whispering about pizza, and Jacob's voice breaking as he remembered his mother's laughter, and she began to speak. "Mr. Castellano, I apologize for overstepping, and if you want to fire me after this conversation, I'll understand. but I've been observing your children for 6 months now, and I believe I've seen something that you need to know, something that might change everything." And Richard stiffened, leaning forward, and said, "Have you noticed a symptom the doctors missed? A pattern in their decline?" And Grace shook her head slowly and said, "No, sir. I've noticed the opposite. I've noticed that when you're not in the room, your children are different. They laugh, they play, they have energy and color in life, but the moment they hear you coming, they become the sick children you expect to see, and I don't think they're faking. I think their bodies have learned to express what their hearts feel, which is that being ill is the only way they know to keep you close, to matter to you, to have your attention and your love." The silence that followed was devastating. Richard's face went through a series of transformations, from confusion to anger to denial to something that looked like he'd been struck, and when he finally spoke, his voice was shaking with barely contained emotion. "How dare you suggest that I don't love my children? That I want them to be sick? Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed? What I've spent? What I've done to try to save them?" And Grace remained calm, her voice gentle but firm. "I know you love them, sir. Anyone can see that. The question isn't whether you love them, but how you're showing that love. You've given them the best medical care money can buy. But have you had dinner with them? Have you asked about their dreams? Have you read them a story, or played a game, or helped them talk about missing their mother? Have you let them see you cry, let them know it's okay to grieve? Or have you been so afraid of losing them that you've related to them only as patients, not as children who need their father to be present, not just as a medical advocate but as a dad?" Richard stood abruptly, walked to the window, his hands clenched into fists, and Grace thought she'd gone too far, expected him to order her out, but instead, she heard a sound that made her heart break. He was crying, deep wrenching sobs that seemed torn from the center of his chest, and he said, "I don't know how to do this without her. Catherine was the one who knew how to talk to them, how to make them feel safe. I was always the one who worked, who provided, and after she died, I was so terrified that I'd lose them too. Every cough sounded like the beginning of the end, and when they started getting weak and tired, it confirmed my worst fears. And yes, I threw money at it, hired experts, because that's what I know how to do. That's how I solve problems. But you're telling me that I'm the problem, that my love is making them sick." And the anguish in his voice was so raw that Grace stood and crossed the room, and in a gesture that violated every employer-employee boundary, she placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're not the problem. Grief is the problem, loss is the problem, and fear is the problem. But you can change this. It's not too late. Your children are still here, still waiting for you to see them, really see them, and to give them what they need most, which is not another specialist or another treatment, but you, fully present, willing to be human and broken and healing alongside them." Over the next hour, Grace told Richard everything she'd observed, the card games, the laughter, the way the children transformed based on his presence, the longing in Emma's voice when she talked about pizza, the tears when Jacob remembered watching cartoons with their mother, and, with each example, she watched Richard's understanding shift, watched him begin to see his children through a different lens, and finally he asked, his voice hoarse, "What should I do? How do I fix this?" And Grace said, "I'm not an expert, but my daughter is a resident at Yale New Haven, and she mentioned something called psychosomatic illness, physical symptoms that come from emotional distress. Maybe you could consult with a child psychologist, not another medical doctor, but someone who specializes in grief and trauma in children. And maybe more importantly, you could just try being with them differently, not as a worried physician, but as a father. Do normal things, bring joy back into this house, help them remember what it feels like to be kids instead of patients." Richard nodded slowly, and Grace could see the gears turning, the way his business mind was trying to create an action plan. But then he stopped and said, "Will you help me? I don't know how to do this." And clearly you see things I don't. I know it's not your job, but I'm asking not as your employer, but as a father who's desperate not to lose his children to his own blindness. And Grace felt the weight of what he was asking, but she also felt a sense of rightness, a sense that this was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she agreed. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Richard reached out to Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist specializing in grief therapy, who came to the estate and spent time with Emma and Jacob separately, then together, then with Richard, and after her assessment, she confirmed what Grace had observed. The children were suffering from complicated grief compounded by anxiety and a maladaptive coping pattern, where illness had become their unconscious strategy for maintaining connection with their surviving parent, and she recommended a gradual reduction in medical interventions coupled with family therapy, play therapy, and a return to normal childhood activities and routines. Richard was terrified. What if he was wrong? What if they really were sick and he withdrew medical care? But Dr. Chen gently explained that they'd monitored the children carefully through the transition, that she wasn't suggesting medical neglect, but rather a shift in focus from looking for physical disease to addressing emotional wounds, and that the children needed to feel safe being healthy, needed to know their father wouldn't disappear if they weren't sick. The first test came 3 days later when Richard, following Dr. Chen's coaching, dismissed the morning nursing staff and entered the medical wing, not in his usual state of anxious assessment, but carrying a box of art supplies. And he sat down between the two beds and said, "Your mom loved to paint. Did you know that? Before you were born, she used to paint landscapes. And I thought maybe today, instead of tests and medicine, we could try painting together. And you could tell me about her. Tell me what you remember, because I miss her so much, and I think maybe we should miss her together instead of pretending we're okay." And for a long moment, the children just stared at him in shock. And then Emma started crying, and Jacob started crying, and Richard started crying, and Grace, who was watching from the doorway with Dr. Chen, had tears streaming down her own face as she watched this broken family finally begin to be honest with each other. The weeks that followed were messy and non-linear. There were days when the twins seemed to regress, when the symptoms returned, and Richard's panic would spike. But Dr. Chen helped him understand that healing wasn't a straight line, that the children were testing whether it was safe to be well, whether he'd still love them if they weren't sick. And gradually, incrementally, things began to shift. Richard started having breakfast with the children every morning, not in the medical wing but in the kitchen, and at Grace's suggestion, he asked them to help him make pancakes the way Catherine used to. And the first time Emma stood on a stool to pour batter and Jacob measured out chocolate chips, laughing when he spilled them everywhere, Grace saw Richard's face transform with something like wonder, as if he was seeing his children for the first time in 2 years. He cleared out half the medical equipment, turned the sterile medical suite back into what it had been, a playroom and study area, and he started reading to the twins every night, the same books Catherine had read. And they'd talk about her, look at photos, tell stories. And Richard learned to say "I miss her" instead of pretending to be strong. Learned to let his children see his grief, so they'd know theirs was allowed to. Grace continued to work at the estate, but her role had quietly expanded. She'd cook meals with the children, teach them Nigerian songs, tell them stories about her own daughter, and provide a kind of steady, warm presence that the house had been missing. And Richard came to rely on her not as an employee, but as a trusted friend, someone who'd cared enough to risk everything to tell him a truth he desperately needed to hear. 4 months after that first conversation in the study, Dr. Chen did a full assessment and found that Emma and Jacob's symptoms had virtually disappeared. They had normal energy levels, healthy appetites, color in their cheeks, light in their eyes, and she said what everyone already knew. They'd never been physically sick. They'd been emotionally starved, and the medicine they'd needed wasn't in any pharmacy, but in their father's presence, attention, and willingness to grieve alongside them. Richard arranged a small gathering in the garden on what would have been Catherine's 40th birthday, just him, the twins, Grace, Marcus, Dr. Chen, and a few close family friends, and he'd asked Emma and Jacob what they wanted to do to remember their mother, and they'd said they wanted to release butterflies because she'd loved them, and also have pizza and cartoons, and so they did. And as Richard sat on a blanket surrounded by children's laughter, watching monarchs spiral into the Connecticut sky, he felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years: hope and gratitude, and a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. After the guests left, Richard asked Grace to stay for a moment, and he said, "I've been thinking about what you did, how you risked your job to tell me something I didn't want to hear but desperately needed to know. And I can't stop thinking about how different things would be if you hadn't spoken up, if you'd just stayed silent and kept cleaning and let us all continue in our dysfunction. You saved my children, Grace. You saved my family. And I don't know how to thank you for that." And Grace shook her head and said, "You don't thank me. You honor what you've learned. You stay present. You keep showing up for those beautiful children. You let love be louder than fear. That's all the thanks I need." But Richard insisted on doing more. He established a foundation in Catherine's name, focused on supporting families, dealing with childhood grief, funding therapy and support groups, and he asked Grace to help run it, to bring her wisdom and insight to other families who might be struggling the way they had. And though Grace had never imagined herself in such a role, she said yes because she understood now that her purpose had led her to this family not just to clean their home, but to help heal their hearts. A year later, on the anniversary of that first conversation in the study, Richard and the twins surprised Grace with a small ceremony. They'd created a scholarship at Yale in her name for students pursuing pediatric mental health, and Emma and Jacob had written her a letter, read tearfully by Emma, that said, "You saw us when we were invisible. You loved us when we forgot how to love ourselves. You gave us back our dad and helped us remember our mom without it hurting so much. You're not our maid, you're our family, and we love you." And Grace, this strong woman who'd crossed an ocean and worked 3 jobs and raised a daughter alone and always kept her composure, absolutely fell apart, holding these 2 children who'd become so precious to her. And Richard stood there watching with tears in his eyes, marveling at how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered, and how a woman he'd initially hired to dust furniture and clean floors had seen what dozens of specialists had missed, that his children didn't need expensive treatments or experimental protocols. They needed what every grieving child needs: safety, presence, permission to feel, and a parent willing to walk through the darkness alongside them. The Castellano house, once a sterile medical facility filled with beeping monitors and whispered diagnoses, became a home again filled with laughter and music and the smell of cooking, with artwork taped to walls and toys scattered across floors, with tears when tears were needed and joy when joy was possible, with honest conversations about loss and love and the complicated work of healing. And at the center of it all was a father who'd learned that the greatest fortune he could spend on his children wasn't money at all, but time, attention, and the courage to be broken and real and present. And a woman who'd refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier, who'd risked everything to speak a truth wrapped in compassion, and in doing so had proven that sometimes the most important medicine comes not from those with the most prestigious degrees, but from those with the wisdom to truly see, the courage to truly speak, and the love to truly care. And the lesson that echoed through their transformed lives was this: that we can be surrounded by resources and still be impoverished in the ways that matter most. That the deepest sickness is often not in the body, but in the disconnection between hearts. And that healing begins the moment we're brave enough to stop treating symptoms and start addressing the soul. To stop hiding behind solutions we can purchase and start offering the presence we've been withholding. to recognize that sometimes the answer we're desperately searching for is not found in what we can acquire, but in what we're willing to become. Not perfect, not pain-free, not beyond grief, but present, honest, human, and whole.